Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening to our conversation, Listening During Combat, a consideration of multidirectional communication flow during war. My name is Dr. William Howe. Gregory Abel, a PhD student of mine, is going to be working with me on this. He's a graduate research assistant that's contributed greatly to this project. So what I'd like to do is just go ahead and get started on the process behind or the thought behind this article, this presentation, and also the theory that we're really relying on pretty heavily, and then turn it over to Greg for some more in-depth detail before I come back for our conclusion and summary. So when we think about military, we really think about high reliability organizing. Weick and Sutcliffe back in the early 2000s began to notice that although military units are under a great deal of risk and a great deal of exposure from something wrong happening, especially on aircraft carriers, they noticed that accidents rarely happened. So this kind of challenged the idea of normal accident theory, and are accidents something that we have to just accept will be the case, or can we have enough risk communication and raising awareness and listening to be able to prevent these accidents from ever occurring? And why does the military and other military type jobs that are also high risk, such as firefighters or paramedics or surgical teams, have such fewer accidents compared to traditional corporate organizations? So Weick and Sutcliffe proposed this idea of high reliability organizing, and they examined multiple organizations that focus on high reliability, and when we talk about high reliability, what we mean is life and death is usually going to be on the line in these organizations. So what they noticed was 5 different principles that these organizations tended to adopt at both the team and the organizational level, which will become important later as we think about communicating upward, downward, and lateral in this communication studies. So the first thing they noticed was this preoccupation with failure. So preoccupation with failure is something that we usually don't like to focus on. We don't like to think about failing. We don't like to think about journal articles that didn't get accepted. We like to focus on the good parts of our life, the positive parts, the successes we've had. So the articles that were accepted, or the awards we won, or the presentations we made, or whatever. We like to focus on success. Why were we successful? And then try to mimic that. What high reliability teams do, though, is they look for failure. They search out failure, and when they find failure, they actually somewhat celebrate it, because then they can stop that system from failing and move towards a productive system by listening to what is going on with that system. So for example, my wife's was driving her car, started having some problems, when it would take off and start and stop, the transmission would slip a little bit. So we take it into the shop, and they're able to diagnose it and fix it pretty quickly. But if we were to put off that problem, if we were not to be preoccupied with that failure and instead just keep driving on that system, then it could end up breaking down, because we're not listening to the sounds that the car is telling us of that, hey, something is going on here. And it's the same in high reliability organizations. If we're not listening to what's happening on the front line, hey, this is not going right, we keep having this failure here, this machine doesn't seem to be performing correctly, then it could end up with the organization having to shut down, or in the most catastrophic of cases, a loss of life. So another way is a reluctance to simplify. This is one that we're really focused on in this study. So Greg will talk about it a little bit more on the next slide. But reluctance to simplify really means that in the military, you try, or in any HRO, you try not to oversimplify issues, right? So whether that's having redundancy plans or contingency plans, whether that's having more language, but making sure that that language is saying exactly what you want to say. So for instance, sometimes, even in the academy, we we try to be specific in our language when we're writing a journal article, which may lead to a longer paragraph or a longer sentence than just saying something really quickly. But it's more specific, it's more precise, and that leads to a better understanding from our audience of exactly what we mean. So when we're refusing to simplify in the military, it's saying that I'm not just going to take the base solution, and I'm not just going to have one option, and if that option fails, then we're not able to perform the function of the group or the unit, but instead we're going to have multiple options to success. Another one is sensitivity to operations. A lot of times in organizations, operation units get a little bit left behind, whether that's the HR department or whether that is, tech information technology resources. But as we've seen, throughout the world, if a software system goes down, the whole airports can shut down, planes can be delayed. All of this can stem from not being sensitive to those operations. So with high reliability organizing, we actually give a little bit more credence, a little bit more voice to operation departments, which we used to just assume operation departments are going to run. Now we're listening to those departments and listening to those needs and making sure they have what they want so that they can run successfully. Because if they don't, then the whole system goes down. So it's not just the frontline troops that we're concerned about. It's how do we get food to the frontline troops? How do we get supplies there? How do we show that we have multiple ways that we can be sensitive to, whether it's roadside bombs or attacks from drones? How can we still get supplies to our troop and still perform that supply line operations? And also, telecommunication and satellite and all the new things that we're facing in 2024. Commitment to resilience. So there's two types of resilience that HRO scholars will talk about. One is kind of the bend but don't break. So you think of a plant that grows. I happen to live in Lubbock where it's very windy. You think of these trees you see, and the wind pushes them over and pushes them over, but then they bounce back and they don't break. So that's the first type of resilience that we try to commit to, that we're going to face obstacles, we're going to face hard times, but how do we face those without breaking? The second one is, again, living in Lubbock, which is kind of deserty. If you don't know about Lubbock, Texas, not a lot of water, but yet we see a lot of cacti, these types of succulent plants surviving because they found a way to be resilient even in a more desert area, right? So they found a way to grow even in a place that is maybe unsustainable, we would think. So this type of resilience is another one that we have in organizations. When you're sending a military unit to a place where, like whether it's Iraq or the mountains of Afghanistan, or we see the war in Europe, we think of how do we survive in these harsh elements. So then deference to expertise is one that's often relied on as well in HROs. So this is saying, like, if somebody has technical expertise in an area, they should be listened to more than perhaps someone who's just been in the organization for a long time. So for me, when I was in the military as a combat medic, I was listened to a lot for medical advice, right? So if someone was shot or someone was hurt, it was up to me to take care of them and I had preference, and people who'd been in the military 20, 30 years would listen to what I had to say about their medical condition instead of relying on their own opinions because I was the medical expert on the ground. And we see this occurring a lot in different units, whether it's, engineers, there was with some of the spaceship operations, there have been cases where the experts were not listened to, and it resulted in tragic loss of life, which has led us to really know the expert voices matter, and we need to listen to experts in different areas, not just in military endeavors, but throughout organizational principles. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague here, and he's going to talk through the basis of the study and what we're looking at to do in this study, and then I'll come back for a conclusion at the end.
All right, thank you very much for your time and attention. My name is Gregory Abel. I'm a second-year Ph.D. student here at Texas Tech University in the College of Media and Communications, and I will be helping Dr. Howe here walk through our presentation on listening during combat, a consideration of multidirectional communication flow during war. To start with, I want to go over some of our goals with this project. So what is it we're specifically aimed at? First and foremost, communication within military contexts, both functional and interpersonal, is crucial to the success of military missions. This means both people on the ground being able to convey information to each other clearly about what is happening, as well as being able to build bonds of interpersonal trust that allow them to understand that that information is going to be conveyed and utilized well. Military operations have been praised for adhering to high reliability organization theory principles as evidenced by Vike and Sutcliffe, and these principles boil down to two key tenets. The first is reluctance to simplify. So despite the fact that military communication needs to be quick and efficient, it simultaneously needs to be clear. So for example, the letters A, B, C, D, and E in military phonetics become Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo. The letters themselves are quicker and easier to say, but the use of phonetics reduces the risk of miscommunication in situations where radio contact may be intermittent or unclear, or where there's a lot of background noise making things difficult to hear. This reluctance to simplify ensures that communication is still effective. There also needs to be a sensitivity to operations in terms of conveying information quickly and clearly. So, for example, rather than saying there's a man with a gun half a kilometer away to the east, that message might turn into something like armed foot mobile 500 meters bearing 270. The second message is much shorter and much clearer, and simultaneously conveys concrete information like distance and compass bearing that allow those receiving the communication to respond effectively. Military communication, in sum, is about providing the most information possible in the shortest but also clearest format. Now, lateral communications are crucial within combat actions, but it's important always to remember that combat is less than half the picture. In fact, it is only about 20% of personnel in any given point that actually see combat action within military service. These numbers obviously will vary from war to war and from time period to time period, but the overall message is that combat is only one part of what goes on in warfighting operations. Prior to a combat operation, commanding officers will inform their subordinates of the mission parameters. Those subordinates in turn will inform their subordinates in order to give everyone a clear picture of what needs to be accomplished where and when. During the mission itself, as well as communicating about what needs to be done, commanding officers will change mission parameters as they respond to emergent circumstances. There's a very old aphorism that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and as a result, military communications need to be oriented in part around being able to respond to circumstances as they change. And then finally, after combat operations are concluded, commanding officers will write up mission reports that evaluate successes and challenges, as well as making future recommendations. The hope being that we can learn from what works in one battle and apply it to the next, learn what doesn't work, and hopefully avoid those mistakes in the future. So within all of this, the question starts to emerge. Where do gaps in vertical or subordinate to commander communication start to show themselves, and what effects do those gaps have? Now, for an example of where this takes place and the effects it can have in the real world, we need look no further than the war in Vietnam. Data asserts that in the end, the United States Army failed in Vietnam in part because its metrics for success masked important operational and organizational deficiencies. There are a lot of different factors that go into this, both on the strategic and tactical levels, but for an example, we can look at the concept of the body count. Operations in Vietnam, American operations in Vietnam, were largely oriented around the metric of the body count. Whether an operation was successful or unsuccessful was determined by how many North Vietnamese forces or Southern Vietnamese guerrillas they were found to have killed. The higher the number, the more successful the operation. Now, as you might imagine, this creates some perverse incentives. Troops on the ground have an incentive to report as high a number as they can by counting things like smears of blood or body parts in place of an entire body as one single casualty. Their subordinates in turn inflate those numbers their superiors in turn inflate those numbers to their superiors, and on and up the chain, as everyone has an interest in making the operation look as successful as possible. These inflated numbers give a false impression of how successful operations actually are. No one is getting accurate information, and there's even a question as to whether the information they are getting speaks to their operational effectiveness. What we wind up with, effectively, is a game of telephone being played with bits of bodies. And naturally, this goes beyond Vietnam itself. Existing research has begun to question the ability and the willingness of senior leadership to listen to ground-level reports and implement high reliability organization principles within their organizations. This is in part a function of image. Leaders want to give the impression that our wars are winnable, and in order to do so, they may be unwilling to listen to or properly convey information that they're receiving when reports contradict their narratives or undermine the appearance of competence. So, despite the fact that the initial operations in Iraq were successful, George Bush's appearance on the deck of an aircraft carrier in front of a banner that says "Mission Accomplished" winds up being something that's turned on its head several years later when the war in Iraq is still not done. When we give, or rather when our leaders give false impressions of success based on erroneous information, that winds up having knock-on effects that then counterintuitively erode public trust in the ability of the military to win wars. So walking through some of the research questions that we've proposed for this project. Research questions 1 and 2 are very much in tandem. First, what values of listening are emphasized by ground-level personnel in their interactions with senior-level personnel? In other words, what are these ground-level personnel listening to and for? Flipping it the other way, what are senior-level personnel, so staff officers and field officers, listening to and for when they are interacting with ground-level personnel? Based on the values that we'll be able to find within those 2 research questions, how do these listening values in these interactions diverge between ground level and senior level personnel? Are personnel at different levels of operations listening to and for different things? And research question 4, where applicable, how do these listening value divergences impact the accuracy and efficacy of up-the-chain communication? So as we saw in Vietnam, everyone's own incentives to make their operations look successful wound up providing inaccurate information to those who were making strategic plans. Is this still taking place, and if so, how? What divergences of listening values are they grounded in? On the whole, our goal is to encourage a culture of listening at all levels, or at least evaluate ways in which listening at all levels can be more effectively enacted. Listening is critical at all levels of the military, both during war and peacetime, but especially in combat, and this is for perfectly understandable reasons. If you are in a firefight, you need to be able to receive information as quickly and as accurately as possible to be able to respond and to be able to keep yourself and your squad mates safe. The controversy of this is that listening appears valuable only to frontline personnel under combat conditions, or at the very least, listening is not valued in the same way under different conditions and by different personnel. A sergeant under fire is going to listen to and for different things than will a lieutenant back at base making operational plans. We seek to understand how these acts of listening are performed on the ground and how listening can be improved as information moves up the chain of command. Effectively, how do we keep from talking past each other, and how do we keep from fighting in the war room? How do we ensure that information being provided is being provided accurately and benefiting overall strategic goals? So thank you all very much for listening. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to taking this project further.
Okay, thank you, Greg, for that information. So our goal, yes, here is listening at all levels. So we know that, again, we talked about teams earlier, that there are these organizational teams, and then we also have organizations. So sometimes teams can be the front line where we're seeing organizational commitment to reliability and all of these things play out. Whereas if we talk about, the second, third, fourth line operations, those move higher up the chain of command. So what we're proposing is to focus on listening at all levels. We've seen that teams on the ground tend to be really good at performing listening, enacting listening. But as it moves up the chain of command, we start to see problems and breakdowns, influences of politics and influences of the goals of the commanding officers that don't necessarily align with what's happening on the ground, can lead to miscommunication. And if it's not listening, then and if they're not listening to what's happening on the front lines and relaying that information, then they're really just relaying lies or disinformation to the public at large. So it's not only listening within the organization, but also listening outside the organization from whether it's the media, the coverage, and the media interpreting the listening to what is actually being said by the military and not what how the media wants to interpret it, but listening to all of the communication that is going on can help the public be more informed and aware of the situation. So listening is not only should not only be valuable to frontline personnel, but it seems like that's the case in the military. We talk about all these ways that they're reliable at the beginning, but then upper military tends to forget about some of these principles and goes away from them, and then we see errors like we've seen with the withdrawal from Afghanistan or the mission accomplished that Greg talked about, or the miscounts in Vietnam. We see a lot of miscommunication and disinformation at higher levels because of political motives and all of this that may not align with reality in some ways. So what we're proposing in this study is that we need to encourage listening, and it's very important to focus on listening not only at the ground level where people are in danger of losing their life because they didn't listen appropriately, but throughout military organizations and even beyond to the media and the nation state, to listen to what military is saying so that they can interpret that information correctly and appropriately and be a well-informed public. With that, I just want to show our references here. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach me at william.howe@ttu.edu. That's william.howe@ttu.edu. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or share any of these resources with you. Thank you for your time today, and have a great festival.